Hi everyone, Dr. Fox here with a lecture on how a tax appears in a market model. Let's start out with just a regular supply and demand model. So we've got quantity and price, demand and supply. Now suppose that in this market we have an equilibrium quantity of 500 units and an equilibrium price of $10. Now remember, a tax on either the buyer or the seller will shift that curve to the left by the amount of the tax. So let's say we tax the buyer of the good. So let's put D tax to indicate that is our demand curve with the tax. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it. Why does it shift to the left? Well, if you had to pay more for something at every possible price, then you're going to demand less of this good. Now, let's say that this tax was in the amount of $1.50 per unit. So for any quantity that somebody buys, they're going to have to pay $1.50 more, right? So they're not going to want more of it. Intuitively, they're going to want less of it. So if we actually graph this properly, and really we're very, very finicky about it, then this value here would go down by $1.50. So let's say if the maximum price was $20, now it would be $18.50. So let's walk through how this is going to impact the market, right? So we'll find a new equilibrium quantity. Let's say that we knew that this new equilibrium quantity was 430 units. And let's say that this intersection right here was at $9.50. Now, you might be asking yourself, how is that possible? Because the tax was $1.50, but the equilibrium price is only $9.50. This is actually because there's an important aspect of this. Even though we have taxed the buyers of this good, and we can tell that because the demand decreased, both the buyer and the seller are going to end up sharing this tax. So even though we taxed the buyer of the good, the supplier is going to end up having to pay some of this too, in essence. So this $9.50, right, that is what the seller is getting. So the seller is getting $9.50 because at that 430 units, people are going to have to pay $1.50 for each one. So the price that the buyer is paying is $11. So the price that the seller gets is $9.50 plus tax brings that up to $1.50. And we can even break this down. This rectangle here has an important implication. So that orange rectangle is something called the tax revenue. And just like other kinds of revenue, for business, revenue is however much you sell times how much you're selling it for. Tax revenue is the amount of the tax multiplied by the quantity that is taxed. So in this case, the tax revenue is $1.50 times 430 units, for a total tax revenue of $645. So not all of that $645 is going to be paid by the buyers. Effectively, we took away some of the producer's surplus and turned that into tax revenue. So let's break down these areas of consumer and producer surplus to see how that works. So let's say this green triangle here, that represents consumer surplus before the tax. But remember, after the tax, the buyer is getting consumer surplus below their demand curve and above the price that they paid. So that's a lot smaller than it used to be. Let's use some letters here to break down what each of these areas is. So the letter A plus B plus C is our consumer surplus before the tax. After the tax, the consumer surplus is just A. So what happened to B and C? Well, B became part of this tax revenue. So this is what is called, so B is the consumer's tax burden. Now we can do the same thing for our seller. Let's make that a straight line all the way down so we can really break it down. So before the tax, at the original price and quantity, that blue triangle was producer surplus before the tax. But after the tax, let's do the same thing, break down those areas into letters. So this rectangle here, D, E, and F. So before, producer surplus was D plus E plus F. Well, what is it after? Okay, well, after the tax, the area beneath the price that the sellers get and above the supply curve, well, after the tax, all that's left is F. Well, what happened to D and E? Well, if you note here, D is part of that tax revenue triangle. Right? So D is the producer's tax burden. And of course, what happened to C and E here? Well, that's deadweight loss. It's gone. That's the welfare lost forever because of this tax. Right? So that C represents the welfare loss to the buyers of the good, who now are basically taxed out of this market, and E represents the deadweight loss from the sellers of the good, who can no longer participate in the market, right? So for both of those, these are the 70 units that don't get exchanged anymore because of the tax. So what are our key takeaways from this? Number one, the tax incidence. Tax incidence is how a tax is shared. How a tax is shared points out that it's shared. It doesn't matter who you tax, the buyer or the seller, both are going to end up being impacted. And we can see what that tax incidence is, going back to our graph here, just by looking at those letters. So that's why we use those letters a lot. It's easier to break down the different areas that are lost or gained from interfering in a market. So tax incidence is how a tax is shared, and we could even put a dollar value on it. How much of this tax burden, that's a synonym for tax incidence, tax burden. We can put a dollar value on how much of a tax is being paid by each of the market participants.